Let's do it.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Paul.
Hi.
Paul, I love that name. I'm sorry. It's so open and inviting. You ever get someone that you meet, you're like, it's Joe. Joe sounds bland. I like Joe's, but at the same time, Paul's something that gets me like, Paul.
I've never had someone react to my voice that way. My name that way, but that's great. Thank you.
Well, Paul, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, man?
Long story short, I guess the official version, the official branding version is that I'm an Egyptologist. I'm a former park ranger. I specialize, or I used to specialize mostly in things like ancient Egyptian religion and the social dynamics of power in the ancient world. But given that there were no Egyptology positions open to me when I graduated from the PhD, I ended up sidestepping into media, becoming a sometime TV presenter, eventually a TV producer, and now I'm working for myself, running a podcast and kind of running various entrepreneurial pursuits. So that's the short version.
Well, so with Egyptology, that's a very niche kind of research department, I would say. Even though everyone has this fascination with the pyramids, it seems like everyone's like, I want to go to Egypt and I want to see what Megan Fox saw when she filmed Terminator. And it's like, hang on a second. Like, the weird thing is like, my question to you, with studying Egyptology, there's so many fascinating things about it, but who do you think built the pyramids? That's just the obvious question I have to ask.
Yeah, and it's a very valid question, and it's funny to me that there's still so much debate about this issue, given how much. Let me pull back a little bit for a second, because what I want to do here is I want to frame my response so that people don't go, "Oh, he's just another one of these conservative Egyptologist guys that is going to tell me that
Where are the aliens?
chronology."
Where are the aliens?
Exactly right. So let me reframe this for a second. So I came into Egyptology through the alternative route, right? I was into the Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval and Andrew Collins and John Anthony West. And I was into all that stuff in a big way back at the end of the 90s. And I wanted more. I wanted to know more about the subject because I found it so fascinating, right? And I was studying with this like Egyptian Sufi freaking what is it? Can I swear on this show? Because I have a mouth like a sailor. Okay, thank you. So I'm studying with this like Egyptian Sufi kind of guy at the turn of the millennium, and we're doing like this crazy ass Egyptian martial arts and studying Egyptian spirituality and Egyptian mathematics and symbology and the kind of stuff that you don't generally touch on in Egyptology. And that was all good and well, but I wasn't really comfortable with a lot of the kind of the more intense aspects of being in a group like that, who were really hardcore, like the hardcore yoga and hardcore martial arts. And I dig all of that stuff. I've always done all
them
that
CrossFitters.
Stuff. Yeah, I mean, it was that kind of level of intensity. And I was a young guy. I was in my late teens, early 20s, giving away my age. And I found it all a lot of commitment at the time. Let's just put it that way. It was a lot of commitment. And so I stepped back. And then when I came back to Egypt and the ancient stuff, I ended up getting into academic Egyptology. So my perspective on this stuff is, having come from the alternative arguments, having been exposed to the idea that not aliens so much, but maybe the pyramids were old, or maybe the Sphinx was built in the age of Leo, and that was when the constellation of Leo was rising over the horizon, facing it, blah blah blah. I came from that kind of background, and when I went into Egyptology, over the course of many years, what I realized was that a lot of these alternative arguments were ignoring a lot of evidence that I was getting to see. Not because it was locked away behind closed doors. It's just because it's not that commonly known or accessible, or wasn't online at the time or anything like that. So when it comes to dating the pyramids, the most compelling evidence we have is that we've got really a really good chronology of how they were built. And it starts with something called a mastaba, which is called a mastaba because that's the Arabic word for bench, right? So the earliest Egyptians, what are their concerns after they die? Well, I don't want my tomb robbed. I don't want it dug up by jackals in the desert, right? Who were associated with Anubis, which is why Anubis becomes the god of the dead later. And so, like, how do I protect all of my stuff that I want to take with me? And this is the idea that, they're already believing in an afterlife, that they're going to take all their shit with them. So they have to try and come up with a technology to solve this problem. their technology at the time, it being basically the Stone Age or, the early Bronze Age or what have you, is to build a mastaba, a big brick kind of, or mud brick or stone level flat thing over your grave to stop people and things from digging into it and getting all your stuff, right? And like, eating your body, because they wanted the body preserved. That's why they're mummified. So fast forward a couple hundred years, this technology has been going for a while. And a king called Joseph, who has a vizier called Imhotep, famous name today, right, because of the mummy movies. And he's like, I want to have a really secure mastaba, because at this point, power has been centralized in Egypt, political power, which means wealth has been centralized. So kings, all of a sudden, have got a lot of stuff. They've got a lot of gold they want to preserve, right, and take to the afterlife. That's all their wealth. That's what they need when they get beyond, the pearly gates, so to speak. Long story short, Joseph's like, I want a really secure tomb. How can we do this? And Imhotep, who's like one of the first freaking geniuses in known humankind or human history, says, well, recorded at least that we know his name, says, well, what about I put a mastaba on top of your mastaba? Like, yo, dog, I hear you like mastabas. So I put a mastaba on your mastaba and then 2 more mastabas on top of that. Well, what does that make? Following basic building techniques, that makes a big thing at the bottom and then smaller mastabas going up on top. Step pyramid.
Would that be similar? Because I did a podcast with a guy named James Morris who studies Japanese burial grounds, like the I guess where people would have their tombs and would have these things that was signature where this person lies after they had passed on to the next life. So that would be like me tossing out like maybe 50 grand to beat someone else's tombstone. Like, hey, I got a bigger fucking tombstone. It's got a spear and it's got me holding a sword or something. That's kind of what the whole pyramid idea you're saying is like someone would build bigger to be better and protect more, which means they would have more wealth. So if you're a grave robber, you would look at like, obviously we're going to go to the biggest pyramid because that's the guy that has all the good stuff compared to the others.
Yeah, I mean, what it comes down to is 2 factors. So you've got, yes, the security idea that the bigger this thing is, the harder it's going to be for people to break into, right, and dig down into. And the second fact is, yes, I'm showing off my power and my centralized wealth by having a better tomb than the next person. And there's quite a lot. There's a few arguments, I won't get into the nitty gritty, within Egyptology that say that these expressions of power were the reason that these pyramids started getting bigger and better and better and better. So like, very long story short, I mean, we're looking at hundreds of years, this period, but you get the first step pyramid, and that's the basic building blocks of this technology. And then Seneferu comes along in the next dynasty, and Seneferu's like, okay, I want that, but I want it smooth. And so he ends up building 3 of them in the end. There's one that collapses. There's one that's called the bent pyramid. And it kind of looks like that because it goes up at the wrong angle, and they had to finish it off this way. And then you get the first true pyramid. It's the red pyramid of Sneferu, right? And these are all built before, and we have enough contextual evidence to be pretty damn certain these were all built before, and we can see the evolution of this technology, right? Going back to like 2600 BC, which is still a long freaking time ago. Let's be honest here. Like, why does it need to be older than that? It's crazy. And we see all of this technology developed through those pyramids until we get to the Pyramid of Khufu and the Pyramid of Khafre, which are like the Great Pyramid, the true pyramid, so to speak, the main event, the wonders of the ancient world that are still standing. So I am 99.99 recurring % positive that the kings who have been attributed those pyramids did that. They built those because I've seen the technology. I've studied how the technology developed over that period. And there's just no reason to question, other than some of the ideas that the Greeks had later on, who, of course, when the Greeks talk about Egypt, they're talking from a perspective of this was 2,000 years ago. That's when the Greeks entered Egypt, 2,000 years after the pyramids had been built, for the most part. That's when the Greek texts come from. So if the Greeks and the Romans say, oh, these were built by such and such, or there was a kingdom of Atlantis, blah blah blah.
Well,
They're talking about myth.
If I'll say Buzz Aldrin kind of screwed us over too. I don't know if you've heard, but Buzz Aldrin also released that they said that there was water on the moon. He said there was an obelisk on Mars, and he said that the aliens had built the pyramids. Now, you hearing that, people are like, "What the hell?" But recently, they just found water on the moon, and now everyone's like, "Was he fucking right?" And first of all, is NASA vetting their scientists? It's this weird thing because I'm gonna learn a lot from this podcast. I can already tell, because my silence is not me not understanding. It's me trying to soak it in, because I'm so fascinated with anything that happens to do with how we can look at our lines through history and see how we're still doing the same repeated stuff today, such as this whole thing of trying to be bigger and better. Building a bigger and better pyramid for a king was, I want to be more powerful than my predecessor, the one that was before me. We're doing that today. Someone sees something Kevin Hart does on the internet or something, and they think they have to do that times 5.
Yeah.
But the concept of the afterlife has been so fascinating to me, and it's my theory on why I never want to be cremated, because the ancient Egypts believed that your body was your vessel into the afterlife. That's why they wrapped you. That's why they kept your body preserved, so nothing ate at you, and you could take that vessel across the river or whatever and be able to live with that vessel form. Now, imagine if you're getting cremated, and that is true, that your vessel is the ticket into the afterlife. You're a pile of ash in heaven. That doesn't seem like any fun to me. So that's just been in my mind forever. But the idea of preserving and getting all your belongings, when we hold material possessions so damn valuable, that the concept of that you could take those belongings into the afterlife, that they have that much power of impact with wealth. But that's just the base idea at the time, and still something we're still marinating around with today. People want to be buried with their family rings. And it brought up this whole era of grave robbery, where people were literally taking shovels and digging up their loved ones and bringing them home in the fear that their ancestors or their family members were going to be robbed for their belongings. It's this whole, like, as much as you've seen, we've expanded out. And I think when you said there's plenty of misconceptions in the Egyptology field,
Yeah.
I've listened to Dr. Hancock. I forgot, Carl, what's his name? What's his first name? It sounds,
Graham Hancock.
yeah, Graham Hancock. Sounds wrong when I say Hancock. But I've listened to him talk about the water erosion on the Sphinx, that they figured out there was actually water and everything that was discovered in Egypt. And you're looking at this bared wasteland like, what? But there's plenty of misconceptions. I mean, there's people that have done research articles that have been published, then later found out not to be true, and then do as much as they possibly can to make sure none of that information comes out that it's not true, because it would make them look bad. And it seems like there's this mixed match of trying to find the truth, where it's like, can we just figure out what's real and what's not, and not live by these things because you're afraid that it might make your whole thing be discredited? Let's try and find the truth, because this is what creates all these people coming up with ideas of, it was built by the aliens, it was built by this, because nobody knows. Nobody is, we know, but nobody, like the whole general population of the world, is so pull and torn of everything. It's hard to get down to the baseline of fact.
Yeah, it is. It can be really difficult to cut through the noise. The noise to signal ratio is kind of skewed because, and here's the thing, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of preserving reputation, because that feeds into exactly what we're talking about, like preserving your reputation to the afterlife, ensuring your reputation as the biggest king, preserving your reputation as an academic or scholar. It all becomes very important. All of the scholars I know, all the Egyptologists I know, personally at least, are pretty good at figuring out what their own biases are, and trying not to bring those to the field. Like, that's something that at least academics these days are taught. Don't bring your own biases in to this shit. Like, look at the facts and figure it out from the facts. Figure out what your own lens is. We all have a lens when we come to information, like beliefs. This is an idea from NLP, which I kind of have a passing interest in, but beliefs form filters, right? So if you have a strongly held belief, it actually affects the way that you process the information that goes into your brain, because you're looking at it from a certain perspective. And the Egyptologists of the past did exactly that. The earliest Egyptologists looked at all this material from a very monotheistic, Christian, Victorian, conservative perspective. So their understanding of Egyptian religion is now something that we're all having to critically reevaluate, because it didn't really do the Egyptian systems justice. They were looking for They were looking for the predecessor of monotheism, Christianity, and they were looking for the predecessor of Greek philosophy. And when they didn't find that, they dismissed it all as bullshit. And the simple fact is, they were looking for Aristotle, they were looking for Plato, they were looking for Socrates and Pythagoras. What they actually found was something more akin to the Zen of the desert, if you will, or something possibly, potentially even more, this is a loaded term, but shamanistic. And of course, the Victorian conservative Christian mind can't identify that necessarily, because their belief system doesn't, it filters out the facts, so to speak, and makes you color what you're seeing and categorize it incorrectly. And this is a problem that we all have politically, historically, academically, that is not really being addressed very well. It's starting to be addressed better in the political realm, I think, but that we all get stuck in our own beliefs. And in order to be objective, we have to learn to turn around and look at those beliefs and unpack them and figure out where they came from. Why is X X? And why do I think that? Is that always true? You know, these are questions we can ask ourselves when we're approaching these subjects. And unfortunately, a lot of the alternative, quote unquote, alternative viewpoints on archaeology got a lot of airplay for a long time. And they're generally written by people who, they don't have an academic background, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can do good research without an academic background. Absolutely. But that does mean that there are two factors, I guess. That does mean that you can build a reputation without worrying about the consequences of whether you're going to get tenure somewhere or whether you're going to get a job at a university or not. So you don't have to worry too much about, you know, who disagrees with what or how much evidence you have to back up X, Y, or Z. And I guess the other issue is that, you know, you're then also potentially working from a conclusion with a lot of these arguments. So the thing about the water erosion on the Sphinx that you mentioned, right? I used to think that was a pretty viable argument. And then I read a whole bunch of stuff by a bunch of Egyptologists who also happen to be geologists, because a lot of Egyptologists don't just study Egypt. Like, I came from earth sciences myself. There are a lot of Egyptologists who come from geology. And so a geologist, Dr. Robert Scott in this instance, who was on Joe Rogan actually, and I watched that show because I was curious about what he had to say. And he comes along and he says, oh no, this is water erosion. And if it's water erosion, that means it has to be dated to 8000 BC or so, when there was more water, there was enough water in Egypt to justify this kind of erosion. And that, to the layperson, sounds perfectly reasonable. And in fact, to me at the time, it sounded like a reasonable assertion. So I thought, I'm going to go and check out and see if there's any evidence to the contrary. Turns out there's quite a bit. There's quite a lot of geologists that have gone in there who disagree with Robert Scott's evaluation. Other geologists, there are Egyptologists who've looked at the context of the place and the surrounding temple enclosure of the Sphinx, because it's not just the Sphinx, it's got a temple that goes with it. And there's, long story short, enough evidence to suggest that, yeah, the type of stone this is, this can certainly crack and erode more quickly in the conditions in the morning when you have a lot of like dew and moisture on the Giza Plateau. And this forms little crystals essentially under the surface of the stone. The crystals, when it gets cold, expand because they freeze, and then that causes flaking on the limestone. And some limestone is particularly vulnerable to that. So, long story short, and without going too hardcore into the science of it, you don't know what you don't know, right? That's true of all of us. We don't know what we don't know, so we form conclusions without all of the evidence. If you look into the Sphinx thing more deeply, you look at articles by people like Colin Reeder and Van der Kroes, there's quite a lot of work that's been done to suggest that, well, okay, we've had another look at this because there are some compelling arguments here and we need to address this. And it's still really, there's nothing conclusive enough to redate this thing. Now, there are some other interesting arguments out there. There's an argument that it was once a dog, like Anubis. And there's contextual arguments to suggest that Anubis was the primary, this is the jackal-headed god, right? That sits with a... And there's contextual arguments to say that there's some textual evidence to suggest that Anubis was the god, the main god, the principal god in early dynastic times of the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids and the Sphinx are. And this argument follows that, well, actually, maybe the Sphinx was a jackal, and that's why the proportions look weird. And if you redraw the Sphinx as it is with a jackal head, the proportions look very compelling. And there is a few texts here and abouts from a couple of tombs that suggest that people were saying, I'm going to what we know as the Giza Plateau, under the eye of Anubis, or to be before the presence of Anubis, to lay these people to rest. And you think, oh, that's interesting that Anubis was actually associated with the area that the Sphinx is in. And potentially, that Sphinx head was recarved at some point. But there's a couple of points that we need to bear in mind. One of the first ones is that from the contemporary era of that Sphinx being carved, going from the kind of orthodox Egyptological view, right? We've got other little sphinxes that look just like it that have been buried in caches of, say, Khafre's daughter's tomb, for instance, has a little model of the Sphinx. And it's the same as the Sphinx that we've got. And it's like, well, that's pretty compelling then that they were using this form at the exact time that people are saying that this thing was carved, right? So I think there's room for a little bit of wiggle room, perhaps, on what that monument might have been before it was carved into Khafre's Sphinx as we know it. There's potentially some wiggle room to suggest maybe it was a rough stone carving of something else first, or maybe it's formed because there's a natural form very similar to it in Anatolia, I think it is. Or maybe the shape of the rock dictated how it was cut. And maybe the rock's been there and was exposed for such a long time that it was already weathered when it was cut. Like, these are all possibilities. The rock's been there
Wouldn't
a long time.
a good possibility, for example, I'll give you this, is my issue is with ideologies. I think ideologies, when you're confined to them,
Mm-hmm.
they
Yeah.
heavily influence what your conclusion is going to be. Like you were saying,
Yeah.
the conclusion of back then when early Egyptologists were looking at it from a Christian's point of view, it seems going to be like the conclusion is going to be a tad more spiritual based on just the influence. But now we're in a world now where science is so impedingly heavy.
Mm-hmm.
That everyone's looking at it more like, no, it's erosion levels. It could be something more scientifical than that. My idea from understanding how people hook to ideologies, which I'm not a fan of, but people do it, and I see where it's needed because that's just kind of where you got to find some base roots somewhere. Ideologies heavily influence what a conclusion is going to be or whatever your perspective is on life. And you tend to stick with those and never drop it, meaning that it has to be your version of it or it can't be anything else. When I see the Sphinx, I don't see something that would be confined to as a Anubis or anything of that sort. I look at it like a person putting their face on a beast, considering themselves part God or part of this immense power that these Egyptians were heavily influenced with. And that's just based on my understanding of how people can cling to ideologies. Someone else can pull something completely different from that. And here's where it gets really, you asked if you can cuss on my show. Here's where it gets clusterfucked. So basically, when science and religion start impacting each other and nobody is giving wiggle room for the other person's opinion or view, same thing with Galileo, where the church had to lock him down based on his views and understandings of outer space. It's this whole entire crazy kind of pull and push situation where we have two sides trying to be like, no, well, this is it. You can be a little bit above us, but we're going to be the top dogs. But we're living in a world now where religion isn't as dominant as it was in the past. So all these Egyptologists that are now discovering new things and having issues with the old stuff, it really brings confusion to the public. And that's why when I hear someone say a certain side or a certain story, I start to think when it dives into the realm of religion or when it dives into the realm of science, we're all getting very, very, very small pieces to an immensely large puzzle. And this puzzle that we're all trying to figure out, it's like maybe it's a bit of each. Maybe we all have a little piece that connects and coincides together to create this one giant picture. But nobody wants to have that other person give them their piece. Nobody ever wants to lose their piece. Nobody ever wants to work together because whatever side you choose is the side that's chosen. It's the main one. And it really, when I look at it, I'm like, well, how the fuck are we ever going to understand what is real if we're going to keep fighting and every 5 years something different comes out that people either refuse to believe or believe in it? And it's from just trying to understand, ideologies. You're going to have your base influence based on what you've discovered and what you've seen. And from what I've heard from different podcasts or from what I've come across, I'm going to have my different sides. But where's the meeting point? Where
Mhm.
can we understand our past? Because it's something, with even all that bullshit aside, all that craziness that stops and hinders our progress, we're still trying to understand the past, something that is not happening anymore. And we're just looking at records. Hierog- Hieroglyphics, that's one word I can't say. It is basically, we're using that today with emojis. We're expressing ourselves through different types of pictures and all these things to be able to understand emotion, and understanding what we know from when we see them in the walls. We're assuming things based on what we might have thought they might have meant, not what
Mm,
they actually mean. That's why there's
mm,
always research coming out saying, well, actually, now they're finding out it means this. It's like,
mm.
it's why it's so complicated and why history is so damn important, not to just hold on to the past, but to remember not to make the same mistakes in the future. But also with
Yeah.
this, our conversation that we're having now, logging this, so where someone might come across it later, you can get it better with video than you can if someone wrote it on a fucking wall. Like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? It's way more impactful. And it's like I said, this is just so fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I kind of started the conversation around those topics with my disclaimer of, hey, I came from this one perspective before, and I changed my mind based on evidence. Now, some people might say, hey, this guy got brainwashed by the institution. And I guess my response to that would have to be, I actually don't work in the institution. I haven't worked in the institution since I was a PhD student. Like I'm not tethered by the so-called or perceived biases of the academy in my position, because I've got nothing to lose by turning around and saying, if I believe that the Sphinx was 12,000 years old and was once a dog, I'd probably get more YouTube hits, if I'm frankly honest, you know? But I have to go with what I feel is compelling enough to be true, and try not to mislead myself or anyone else. So I think you're absolutely right, though. There are conversations that need to be had. And I'm hoping to try and tackle some of that in the future in the podcast, where I get a friend of mine. A friend of mine's really into the alternative theories. He just loves all those books. And so, but we get on well enough that we can have these conversations. And I think having some conversations, reaching out across the divide, so to speak, and trying to get to the bottom of, well, what is so compelling about these ideas? Why do you feel like this has to be challenged? And is there anything compelling enough for me to turn around and go, yeah, okay, that's an interesting question, and I think maybe there's a weakness in the research in X, Y, or Z. That's the first step. I think, at least, like you say, having those conversations. And it's a shame it's not easier to do that, because you're right. It feels like it's been so much is polarized right now, and you're a one or a zero. It's this kind of binary argument of you're in the alternative camp, quote unquote, or you're in the Egyptological camp. And I wrote a book a few years ago where it was based on the PhD, and in that, one of the things I'm trying to do is tear down this divide to say, hey, not all Egyptologists were that conservative or that concerned with, you know, keeping it scientific, or, there were a lot of people crossing that so-called perceived boundary or division. And the same is true of the quote unquote alternative camp, who will get lumped in together as like this huge bunch of revisionists. And that's not true either. That's generalizing, but the brain generalizes. It comes back to that psychology. The brain likes to generalize and categorize, because that's how it handles big concepts. So we need to kind of start again, just re-examining our own positions and going, well, if we're honest with ourselves, you know, not all Egyptologists may subscribe to particular X, Y's, or Z's. That's how progress moves forward, right? We need to try and be more transparent and communicate those things better to the public, so that the public don't fall into the trap of aliens, like that. And that's on us to a big degree. That's on academic Egyptologists, who, I say us, I'm not I don't work for a university or a museum anymore or anything like that. But that's why the public archaeology and public Egyptology is so necessary. But I think it's improving. like most of my generation and beyond, they're all on social media. They're all putting podcasts out, videos out, trying to explain their positions and their conclusions and engage with people, which is a good thing. That is a good thing.
It's
I
good
hope.
to it's good to have that information there, but don't consider that the definitive answer. You
Mm.
have to look at all aspects. If someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, there are no debates. Just on the concept of it's just about who's the better salesperson, who's the most convincing person in an argument to be able. Because he had a conversation with a woman who was into the horoscopes, astrology, all these types of things, and she was looking at it like, well, you were born under this sign, and just going off and so much. He goes, but it was created by people that were taking massive psychedelics and looking up at the stars. Of course, you're going to see a fish or a person with a bucket in their hand. It's going to happen. And she was completely refusing it and just saying, no, it's not possible. No, it's not possible. And she was saying that JFK, each one of his family members were killed on like a third moon or something like this, where it was like, okay, well, we can look up JFK, his death, but what about his family? So you just said evidence that we don't have, that we would have to go digging for on live television. So immediately you seem correct. It's this whole
Mm.
way of how you can pursue your audience. And sadly, people, when they hear something, they just run with the first thing. I like to look at everything. If I hear someone say something about something on a podcast, I need to find it and hear it somewhere else. I need to keep hearing it until I get massive confirmation that's how it is. And even then, I still technically don't believe. It's a
Yeah.
concept of, I think we're all really trying to give an answer and give a conclusion on something. And once
Mm.
you run with that definitive answer, you might be wrong, because the
Yeah.
aspect of you got to be open to shit, man. We don't know. It could, maybe it's aliens. I have no clue. The shit with the monoliths right now is really kind of getting me antsy when it comes to like, is people creating this, or is it like acupuncture for our Earth where they're just finding all the certain key points onto our planet and then next thing you know, we're dead. But it could be just something else. Like I said, it's this whole conglomerate of, I wish there was more information, but that's what makes it so damn interesting, is that
Yeah.
we love
Yeah.
finding it out.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. The mystery is the key, right? And I think part of the problem of, exactly like you say, the sales pitch of Egyptology and archaeology in the past is that when you're taking a really compelling mystery and then you're covering it, essentially, to use a rough analogy, you're covering it with a bunch of dry articles going, well, actually, the truth is to this, goes to this period. It's like, no one gives a shit about that. They want the mystery, they want the excitement. And the key is really to look at, well, but this is still fucking exciting, isn't it? Like we're looking 5,000-6,000 years back into the past at the origins of human beings going from scrabbling around the desert, hitting things with axes and using bows to just bring things down and living for fucking 20 years, you know, 30 if they're lucky, to organized social coherence and people learning, wait a second, this is the key for me. This thing stands for something else, symbol, right? Where does symbol come from in the human mind? This thing, I'm going to make this hippopotamus out of clay and I'm going to put it in this ground and it's going to become sacred because it's a reflection of this God. And somewhere along the line, humans conceived of deities. And this creates an almost viral form of language that all of the ancient Near East and Middle East starts to use at approximately the same time. And they give them different names, but they use them to communicate with each other. And eventually that becomes a route to power for one individual. Kingship. This is where kingship comes from. That to me is fucking fascinating. And the notion that we're still seeing this process happen. We're still seeing people putting themselves in between humanity and whatever it is you worship. It might be you worship money. It might be you worship science. It might be, it's all, and this is, I think, part of the problem as well. It all becomes, like you say, an ideology or a belief system. People are treating science like a belief system. Well, to quote, I fucking love science, right? Science is great. It's one of the most useful processes that we have to get to the bottom of certain situations. It's not a fucking belief system. It can't help you heal from heartbreak. It can't explain, various things about the universe yet. It
Hold
can
on a second.
explain.
You tell me you can't heal me from heartbreak. Have you taken enough B vitamins? They do a damn good thing.
I mean, the simple fact is that certain tools are good for certain things, right? Religion has its own appeal and uses, and I'm not making any value judgments on anyone who's, someone might be watching might be incredibly religious. Cool, you do you. As long as that's working for you and it's not, oppressing anyone else, fine. Yeah, there's no problem with that. But religion has its particular use. It can't be used to explain the shape of the world or the age of the world, or
That's my problem with ideologies is
yeah.
whenever I asked a question when I was in church was like, well, that's just how it is. I said,
Mm,
well, why the fuck is it like that? It's the only example, if you ever get into a religion and science debate with anybody or argument with someone, they always go, well, then how do you explain the Big Bang? And that's just the one thing in science that can't be explained. We have no
mm,
clue how it happened. It just happened. And they were like, well, the creator said there would be light, and then there was light. Okay, so you have that one thing, but it's also the concept of an ideology. Let's focus on stuff that we can understand. My interest here, I live in a beach town, and this just hit me the other day. We had a really bad storm, and sand was flying through the air and hitting people, and it was hitting your skin at like 40 something miles an hour. It was fucking
mm,
harsh. I want to know what that was like living in the fucking desert when a
uh-huh.
sandstorm would come. Imagine that. That's something that we can get an answer on. How painful that was. How something like that, how people had to survive in that type of climate and then
Yeah,
create something that is still baffling us today.
yeah, yeah. That's exactly it, isn't it? And there's a field called phenomenology in archaeology, and that's what that tries to do. It tries to get into the mindset of the people in the ancient world to see, like, what was it actually like to live in this period? What would it have been like to walk into this temple complex? Like, what kind of it? And that's why VR is great. I'm really getting into VR recently
I can
because you
tell you a
can.
blow dart right to the neck. As soon as you walk through, right into your neck.
Well, yeah, most people weren't allowed in, like the ancient temples in Egypt, for instance. They weren't like churches today. You couldn't just go in and pray. They were exclusive. They were, as we understand it, at least, they seem to have just been the remit of the elites, the priesthood. So you weren't getting like the masses into a temple to congregate and pray. That's just not how their religion functioned. Um, so we kind of bring a lot of these preconceptions to the past as well, and to our understanding of the past, which is why there have been so many, and there's been a lot of good work in archaeology over the last kind of 40, 50 years to try and strip it back and go, how did these people think and live and exist, and how do we understand them on their own terms rather than ours? And that's been happening since about the 60s, when people started, doing archaeology and taking LSD and um,
The good
you know what I mean?
times. The
It
good times.
opens things up a little bit, opens the doors of perception, as all just
I think what's so like, because you mentioned it with the whole thing with like the ideologies and stuff too, is the fact of like I love the idea of astronomy. I love that you can like, oh, he's a Capricorn or he's all this, and they go a little too far with like the third sun rising on top of the blue crescent moon on the fucking eve of September. I'm like, okay, you lost me. But I like the concept of it, but then when I hear people get so where that's just how it is, I'm like, well, there's science too. There's other things that go out there, like I think it's December 21st will be the first time that two planets are going to be aligned with each other. That's going to create the best representation of what the North Star would look like. It's going to be the brightest. Last time it happened was like
Is
300
that this
something
year?
years. Yeah, it's this year. That's December
Fascinating.
21st. So it's
It's pretty
that.
much the solstice as well, right?
Yeah, well, it's Venus or whoever that lines up perfectly creates this giant bright light that's going to happen. It's going to look exactly like a giant Christmas star, and it hasn't happened in like 300 something years. People are looking at like, well, that's a Capricorn with its back turned. So I'm like, it's not. It's two planets that are being aligned with our planet. There's so many misconceptions where I'm like, I love the fantasy behind it. I really do. I think it's fucking awesome. I love talking about the gods. I love these mystical powers of giving humans this ungodly like power and this mystery and magic. That's why I think religion is needed. But at the same time, you have to understand there is evidence now to be able to prove of why that is happening, having that conclusive thing. The hard part is saying that means you're conforming to one idea. And then that disputes the whole argument of, well, you're
Hmm.
conforming to an idea. And it comes to this giant push or pull. Like we're back at the start again. It's like we're eating our own tail like a snake. It's like,
Hmm.
when can we just understand that you're going to have your idea of something? I'm going to have my idea of something, and neither have to be incorrect. They can all just be one piece of the puzzle. Having that thought in there has changed my life on everything. I am so
Yeah.
fascinated, not with things that we're trying to solve, but with things that we've glossed over. Things we've glossed over, like wealth. Why is it today that money is still worth so much to us as it did back in the day. And that assumes your wealth class. That assumes how someone has to respect you. Someone who's poor doesn't get the same amount of respect as someone that is middle class, has something that's maybe below them. It's this weird thing where we're not maybe basing a system off of it anymore like they did in Egypt, where if you were a king, you had all the golds and the poor people couldn't even come into your temple. It's more on the concept of like you see a homeless person and you're shooing them away. It's evolved into something different. We're still doing the same exact concepts, which is not showing growth as a society. It's showing it just a change, not a growth at all.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, a few things in there to pull out, actually. And it's an interesting point because the way that wealth operated, for instance, in Egypt, was they didn't have money. That didn't happen until Alexandria, really, and the Greeks. So, like, we're talking really late, like 300 BC. That's when money becomes a thing in Egypt. Before that, it's all bartering and trade, right? Now, Egypt always, pretty much always, throughout its history, had a wealth surplus. Its wealth was grain. And it used these storehouses, huge storehouses of grain, in order to essentially fund and power all of the other aspects of the Egyptian economy, political life, and stability, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that idea of surplus that enables, in a sense, the centralization of power in the king. And that comes from the fact that geographically they had the advantage of being on the Nile River, right, which has a pretty much clockwork inundation, which makes all the surrounding land fertile, which means they can grow the crops, on the dot every year, and they can pretty much predict what's going to happen. They had some years of drought, they had a couple of famines here and there, but for the most part, pretty steady going for 2.5 to 3,000 years, and probably for quite some time as smaller independent kind of villages and towns for quite some time before what we call the pre-dynastic Egypt. I mean, there were people in that area for many, many thousands of years. And when you look at that, it becomes a political question. Like there's no way you can look at ancient Egypt and people say, oh, I came here for Egypt, I don't want to talk about politics. But the fact is that the two are indistinguishable, because the moment you have someone saying, I'm king, it gets political. It's about power then. And that's one dude. In this case, it is a dude, although there were a few queens as well who sole ruled Egypt. But it's one king, probably, as we know, his name was King Den, which Den is not exactly what you'd call a mythical or fantabulous name, is it? But King Den, King Scorpion, one of
King
these guys.
Hammurabi. I just remember him because he has that last ending part that's like my name. But now we talk about how you get remembered. Well, that dude's remembered as like a deformed, inbred, like messed up skull, all this types of stuff in the books. And I'm like, hold on a second, didn't he do anything right in the world at all?
I don't know, to be honest. Actually, that's not a reign I've looked at very closely.
He had one thing I think that was really important that we still use today, but I think that was it. But I'm like, he was a child emperor. Imagine that. You ever see Justin Bieber and how he was like during his teenage angst years? It's fucking power. Power corrupts absolutely, no matter what age it is.
Does it corrupt or does it reveal? I think it can corrupt, but especially if you get power without the wisdom to. I'm a kind of a fan of the old Stoic philosophers and Marcus Aurelius and things like that. And if you have power and you have the wisdom to wield it, no problem really. But when you get someone in power who does not have the wisdom or the character, and character takes time to build, you have to suffer to build character. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is for the most part. Most of your growth will come when you are uncomfortable, when you are suffering, when you are grieving, when you are at loss, when you are in conflict. That's where growth comes from. And you haven't had enough opportunities as a young person to do that. The Egyptians took a very interesting approach to the way they prepared people for these things. They had kind of this deeply. People would argue it's not philosophical, but it is. It's just a problem of terminology. But it was a kind of a philosophy, and it was a spiritual approach to the world, based in observation of nature for the most part. But there are some really interesting wisdom texts, and the kind of from the father to the son, and to the mother to the son, and the mother to the daughter, etc., the parents would pass on as much wisdom as they could accumulate. And we have wisdom texts from ancient Egypt, in fact. And they would try and prepare children for adulthood. Well, I say children for adulthood. That in itself is kind of a fairly modern concept. You were still a child while you had a side lock on your head, but pretty much the moment you got to quote unquote breeding age, you turned into an adult and you had to grow up fast. Remember, lifespan for the commoner, 30 years tops, probably.
They say that, but a lot of that, like the statistics are actually skewed because of how they're taking it. They're finding a medium
Yes,
of
yes, that's true,
base
because there were a lot
age.
of
Yeah.
child deaths.
Yeah, but also murders and stuff too. You got to think people are just killing it. Like people that say the average lifespan's gotten better. It statistically, yeah, because people are getting shot at older ages now. But back in the day, it was like you got killed as a kid or you got killed as a grown adult. People could
Well,
live to be
disease as
90.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you were king, like Ramesses, lived up to 90 odd. If you were king and you had a good diet, back then,
I
that
would not want to live that long, dude. Oh my
well, think about
God.
that. Think about what that looks like in the ancient world. Because even though, yes, you can prove or misprove anything with statistics, we know from enough records that the average lifespan, because of disease, right? For the most part, it was because of disease, because of diets, because infection rates were high. The Egyptians had sand in their bread because of the way that the
Yeah, they're grinding down their teeth.
exactly. So dental health was very, very poor, which meant that people were dying of abscesses and various infections, even without being exposed to diseases and plagues and things like that. The water could go bad, all kinds of things could kill you. And there was a very, as you rightly say, the stats will be altered by this, a very high rate of infant mortality. That being said, of course, you had to grow up real fast. You couldn't be a kid as long as we are kids, essentially. Some of us are still kids into our 30s, and you didn't have that opportunity then. You had to grow up, which kind of comes back to the idea of they were preparing their kids for adulthood to be as good an adult as you could be and live in accordance with ma'at, which is the concept of harmony and justice and divine order, etc., etc. But if you look at the reign of, say, Ramses, you can't. I mean, you can imagine how you would say, this guy must be a god on earth. He must be the representation of Horus on earth. He has outlived, I think he outlived like 13 of his children, right? And several generations. You would be born into the world with Ramses having been king up into your grandparents' time or your great-grandparents' time, having outlived pretty much everyone you've ever known. Well, this guy's the king. He must be God. And if you're in a position where you've got the best resources, you've got the best medical treatment, you've got, the food that's going to keep you healthy, you're not exposed to the sun, you're not exposed to disease, you get the chance to live that long and seem divine.
There's a cool thing to research on that is how many times was there an attempt assassination on him? You got to think how many times people always bring up the concept God doesn't bleed. How many people have tried thinking that this man is a god? How many people have tried to attack him to make him bleed to see or test that faith or to test that idea? It's so freaking weird when you look at it like that, and then you look at today's times and you're like, we're still thinking on those lines, maybe not in those terms, but we're still thinking with that train of thought. Like, hey, like I just watched a really good show I never gave the chance to. It's kind of the opposite when we're talking about right now, more on the lines of the future thing. It's called The Orville with Seth MacFarlane, the guy who created Family Guy. It's supposed to be like a Star Trek parody, but like it was this whole concept of like it's 2,000 years into the future, flying in starships on the Enterprise and shit. And it's just like how it was on Earth. They had a thing where there's a race of robots that destroyed their creators. And it's like, we're kind of creating artificial life and going to put that in slavitude to do our simple chores for us. How long until that develops a consciousness and then rises above us? It was this whole like dark mirror type shit where it was just showing you all these things that like you're looking at it like, aren't we doing that now? Like they had a button on their shirt and the button had an up arrow and a down arrow, and what someone would post a picture of you doing something and people would see it and be like, oh, he's humping a statue or he's doing something crazy. Then everyone would downvote him and it would be their justice system where they would get put into a court, and if they hit 10 million downvotes they'd be killed. That's what we're doing today. We're using social media in the dumbest fucking way of perception. And it's like things were happening where it was like, Like there was two guys sitting on a bus and a pregnant woman was standing there and there were no seats available. So someone took a picture of that when it looks like the guys didn't see her. That's all. They didn't get up and give her the spot. They just didn't see her. They were on their phones or something. But the world saw that and said they're being rude and they're horrible people and they need to die. And the next thing you know, that got on the media and they got 1 million downvotes or 10 million downvotes and they got killed or they got corrected, which is they changed the neural pathways in your brain and it's a small possibility you die. I'm like, it's the same shit we're doing now. We're putting people up on pedestals and then taking them down and attacking them whenever we get the chance, because we're at this idea of we want to be God, and anybody who's not God is against us, is someone that shouldn't be on that pedestal. And I believe having that pedestal, we're always just looking to put someone up there, then always looking to take someone down. It's like fucking chess.
100%, and that's been going on for a very, very long time. You know, they love to see a hero and a success story, and then they love to see that person torn apart. And that's a very brilliant kind of commentary on the way social media seems to be operating. And it's dangerous territory to even talk about the kind of the shitstorm and lack of empathy that is cancel culture and the kind of the problems that we're having to just dealing with these new platforms. You try and think about how that worked in the record. If I'm just staying in my capacity as an archaeologist here or Egyptologist here, you can see, like, after the fall of the Old Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom's when all the big stuff is made. The main pyramids are all made, you know, and serious centralization of power and wealth. And you really see the notion, the idea of the king being divine being really prominent at this period. Like, no one else has access to the gods. It's just the king. You have to go through that king. No one else gets to be taken into divinity like the king does. You know, you can't access the religion except through his elite priesthood. And every offering made is made on behalf of the king. How do we know that? Because every inscription that's made of a religious offering from that period starts with a phrase called Hotep Denisu, an offering which the king makes, or an offering made on behalf of the king. So every time you pray to your God, you're doing it via the king. And then to answer your question, so I don't stray off topic, we see after the collapse of the Old Kingdom into what we call the first intermediate period, where chaos starts to reign in the land. You've got a bunch of different guys all trying to be king and like vying for power, but no central authority. And a new type of literature emerges called Theodicy. And this is a kind of literature throughout the Middle Kingdom. It kind of that's quite pessimistic, it's quite cynical, and it's saying, how do these gods allow all of the evils that I've seen in the land? I think it's called the Dialogues of Ipua. How is God? And it's the first time that we see it in history that someone turns around and goes, if God is real and omnipotent, then why is there evil? It's the first time we see that concept expressed by humans that I know of. Later, the Greeks would do it, and later philosophers would do it as well. And it's really, they struggle for quite a long time to reconcile if God is all the things that we've been told God is, and Pharaoh is all the things that we've been told Pharaoh is, then why is all this shit happening? Why are people being killed? Why are there bandits coming into our towns and killing everyone and raping our women and shit and stealing all our grain and our supplies? You know,
you just gotta have faith, dog. That's all they say.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. Like, and then the priests turn around and say, well, no, you've got to follow the line, and the gods will sort it all out. And that leads to some really interesting religious developments, which we don't have time to go into really, but people's conceptions of gods changed over time because of that, because of the loss of central authority. And I dare say we're kind of seeing something like that happening again now in our age, this critical questioning of authority. And it's been happening for the last century and a half or so, and it's really building to a peak in social media. But we're all doing it to each other as well, which is the crazy thing.
There's just a line that needs to be drawn there where we got to make sure that as we're building this giant refute or decadence, whatever you want to say, we're not destroying our own innocence. Yeah. We're not tearing apart each other. There's this big issue where as much as we have all this pent up aggression and all this anger and wanting to tear things down, we got to make sure we don't self-destruct our own thing. Like every civilization has basically done before us, every dynasty, all these things that have torn themselves apart. We're basically repeating the same shit. It's like, guys, if it happened that many times before, and just because we're a little bit more advanced, we're still the same people. Just the things around us became more comfortable, I would say.
Yeah, 100%, dude. We are not immune to that and to the mistakes of the past. And I've studied enough collapsed civilizations to realize this isn't forever. What we've got going on here is fragile, and civilization's always been fragile. The one thing the Egyptians really did understand, and that I have to give them credit for, they understood that life was a battle, constant battle against entropy, and only your will and your character and your spirit will, to put it in those terms, will carry you through that. And you have to understand a certain amount of empathy and wisdom in the exercise of all the power that we're given now. Social media is power, obviously, and people are a little bit drunk on it and forgetting the basic precepts of mutual respect and empathy and the benefit of the doubt, I think, in a lot of cases. But I don't want to go too far into that territory, because that needs its own big discussion in itself, I think. But yeah, you're right, we're not immune to that. And we act like we are. We take it for granted that our civilization will persevere, and we create fiction about our civilization in the future having persevered. Yeah, there's some dystopian stuff as well, but it's still our civilization persevering. Not necessarily true. We could lose all of this. The language, the technology, everything. It's all been lost before. Maybe it didn't get quite as detailed and technical as it has, but if we were to lose access to power and electricity and things like that for long enough, well, what happens to all those digital records? They're gone. So yeah, hubris. It's always been a downfall, man, and it looks like it always will be.
Dude,
Every generation has to learn that lesson.
I couldn't say it any better myself. I mean, I don't get any of my stuff from research, but I get my stuff from Netflix, and it does a pretty damn good job. But seriously, thank you for giving me the ability to talk to you today, man. I know
Thank you.
Setting this up, I'm so excited for this, mostly because I knew it was gonna be something I was gonna learn from, and I appreciate you giving me your time. Is there a place people can find you at if you want to promote? I'll make sure I put it in the description as well, where people can find your podcast, where people can find just you in general.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to come on today and to talk to you. I really enjoy what you're doing here. And as for finding me, the main thing I'm doing at the moment is the Profane Humanities Podcast, which can be found on all good podcast outlets. It's on most everything. So Profane Humanities Podcast. And I'm at Doc Harrison on Twitter, and at Profane Podcast on Instagram. That's kind of where you'll find me the most. Yeah.
I'll make sure I link it in the description. And thank you for listening to this episode Out of the Blank Podcast.